My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm 26 years old. When I was 19, I found a small, hard lump just at the base of my neck. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a swollen gland or a pulled muscle. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It didn't hurt, but it didn't go away either. I brought it up at dinner one night, gently, not wanting to cause a stir. But my mother's eyes sharpened with that familiar exhaustion, and my father barely glanced up from his plate. "Stop trying to make everything about you," she said coldly, slicing through her roast chicken like my words had wasted her time. For most of my life, I had been told I was too sensitive, that I felt things too deeply, that I always needed something to be wrong to feel seen. I had stomach aches as a kid, migraines as a teen, and now this lump, and every time it was the same. You're imagining it, or worse, you just want attention. But this time felt different. My body was whispering something urgent, and no one in that house was listening. I made an appointment with a free clinic downtown, using bus money I'd saved from skipping meals at college. When the doctor ordered an ultrasound, I felt both terrified and validated. When I got home, the envelope with the results came 2 weeks later. I remember how carefully I peeled it open in the hallway, like truth deserved reverence. Before I could finish reading the words "further investigation advised," my mother snatched it from my hand. Her eyes skimmed the lines, and then, in one horrifying motion, she held it over the stove and set it on fire. "No more of this," she said, like she was exercising a lie. "You're not sick, you're just addicted to being pitied." I stood there, frozen, while the paper curled and blackened, taking my sanity with it. I stopped talking about it after that, but the lump didn't stop growing. It became a quiet passenger in my body, a hard reminder under my skin. I told myself I could wait. Maybe it would go away. Maybe I was being dramatic. That's the thing about gaslighting. It doesn't just make you question others. It makes you doubt your own pulse. But my breath started shortening. My nights became shallow and restless. I'd wake up sweating, ribs tight, like something inside me was knocking to get out. And then, one ordinary afternoon, while browsing a used bookshop near campus, I collapsed. No warning. Just darkness and the sound of paperbacks scattering across the tile floor. I woke up to fluorescent lights, oxygen in my nose, and a nurse saying, "He's awake." They had found my student ID and rushed me to the hospital. They didn't call my parents, and honestly, I was grateful. I couldn't bear another dismissal. I was too tired to beg anyone to believe me again. The MRI was ordered that same night. I remember the technician's face when she looked at the screen. She tried to stay neutral, but her silence lasted too long, the kind that echoes. When the results came back, a team of doctors walked in, not just one. Their expressions weren't harsh or skeptical, they were grave. And when my parents finally arrived, called in by hospital policy, I saw something I never thought I'd witness. My mother's face went pale. My father's voice cracked when the word tumor left the doctor's mouth. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the problem. I was the proof. Comment: you don't need permission to listen to your body. Lying in that hospital bed, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. For years I had been dismissed, doubted, and silenced. Not just by strangers, but by the two people who were supposed to protect me from the world's indifference. Now that the truth was undeniable, there was no apology. My mother sat in the corner, arms crossed, eyes glassy but distant. My father paced the room like he couldn't decide if he was angry at me or at the reality he'd tried so hard to ignore. I waited for something. Remorse, regret, even a whispered "I'm sorry." But silence hung heavy, louder than words. The tumor wasn't benign. It was growing from a lymph node and pressing against my airway. I needed surgery, not immediately life-threatening, but urgent enough. The doctors said it could have been managed sooner, more easily, with less risk. If caught earlier, I wouldn't have needed the full course of radiation that came after. But the damage wasn't just in my body, it was in my spirit. The years of being told I was overreacting had eaten away at my instincts. I had learned to silence my own alarm bells to keep the peace in a house where truth was always an inconvenience. I remember sitting across from a counselor during treatment, trying to explain the shame of being gaslit by your own family. She looked at me with kind eyes and said, "You were never wrong to speak up. They were just too afraid of what it would mean if you were right." That sentence cracked something open in me. Because in their world, being sick meant weakness, it meant burden. And I, the eldest son, wasn't allowed to be either. I was supposed to be resilient, grateful, stoic. But I was a teenager with a growing mass in my neck, begging to be heard. When the news of my condition spread through the extended family, some aunts and uncles reached out. They said things like I had no idea, and why didn't you tell us? As if I'd been hoarding illness for sympathy. What they didn't know was that the shame had grown as fast as the lump had. I didn't tell anyone because I had been trained to believe my pain was imaginary until someone else confirmed it. I didn't know how to ask for help without sounding like I was performing. During recovery, I returned home briefly. I needed a place to rest, but I found myself tiptoeing again, hiding bandages under hoodies, swallowing painkillers in silence. My mother left pamphlets on the kitchen table about psychosomatic conditions, like she was still trying to erase what the MRI had confirmed. My father avoided my eyes. It wasn't guilt, it was discomfort. My existence had become too loud, and that's when I realized something. I wasn't just fighting an illness. I was surviving a system designed to mute me. I made a quiet decision then. No confrontations, no dramatic speeches. I would heal, and when I did, I'd leave. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. Because sometimes, survival means walking away from those who love the idea of you more than the truth of you. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life proving I was real. I would become undeniable. Not through revenge, but through resurrection. Once I was strong enough to stand without shaking, I began planning my quiet escape. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not distant cousins, not even my doctor. I enrolled in online courses while recovering, focusing on certifications that could help me earn independently. Medical debt was a mountain I hadn't asked for, but freedom, I learned, could be built piece by piece. I applied for remote jobs in the evenings, with an ice pack pressed against my chest, tracing the healing line where the surgeons had cut me open. Every click, every submission, felt like a brick in the foundation of a new life. My mother would knock occasionally, offering tea or asking if I needed anything, always in a tone laced with obligation, not warmth. I nodded politely. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't explain anymore. I just smiled and took my meds behind closed doors. Something in me had shifted. I didn't need her validation. I was becoming my own witness. My father, meanwhile, stayed busy with work, only addressing me when absolutely necessary, as though acknowledging my condition meant admitting they'd failed to see me in time. I saved what I could, sold old books, flipped used electronics online, did small freelance gigs for clients who didn't know or care that I was still healing from surgery. I kept a notebook under my mattress with passwords, budget plans, and exit timelines. It wasn't just about moving out, it was about becoming unreachable. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I didn't want to scream at them or throw the diagnosis in their faces. That would only make me look small. I wanted to rise so quietly they'd have to look up just to notice I was gone. Late one night, I found a studio apartment 3 cities away. It wasn't much, just enough space for a mattress, a foldable desk, and the dignity of breathing air that didn't carry shame. I signed the lease digitally and packed in secret. The hardest part wasn't leaving the house. It was walking past family photos on the way out. Frozen smiles of people who had never really seen me. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe one. They hadn't believed my body when it whispered, and they wouldn't believe my departure if I explained it. As the sun came up that morning, I closed the door quietly behind me. No slamming, no rage, just silence, the kind that speaks volumes. I walked to the bus stop with 2 bags and no certainty, but for the first time in years, I felt light. The absence of apology was no longer a wound, it was a boundary, and I had earned it. I arrived at my new place with shaking hands and a raw throat, but I unpacked every item with reverence. The moment I plugged in my laptop and opened my email, a job offer waited, modest but enough. I accepted it without hesitation. That night, I slept without locking my door, without waiting for footsteps, without wondering who would question my pain. I was alone, and it was beautiful. Living on my own brought a kind of healing no prescription ever could. My body recovered faster than expected, but it was my mind that took longer to trust peace. I stopped waiting for someone to knock on the door just to question my worth. I started working steadily, building a quiet career from my small studio. Clients came, money trickled in, and slowly I became financially stable. I didn't announce anything. I didn't post updates or show off milestones. I didn't need to. I had learned that real growth is invisible at first. It blooms in silence, not applause. Months passed, and I didn't reach out, but they did. First, it was an email from my father. Short, stiff, unsigned. He wanted to check in, though he didn't ask how I was feeling. Just said my mother was worried. It made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was surreal. The same people who had once watched me shrink into myself now wanted proximity without accountability. I didn't reply. I couldn't, because I knew any response would pull me back into a version of myself I'd outgrown, the one who explained, pleaded, and waited. Then came the voicemail from my mother. Her voice cracked when she said, "You should have told us it was serious," as if the MRI had lied and I hadn't. She mentioned how quiet the house felt lately. I could hear dishes clinking in the background, like she wanted me to remember home. But home wasn't a place, it was a battle zone, and I had survived it. I didn't call her back either. Instead, I pressed my fingers to the scar on my neck, a line of truth they had once tried to burn, and whispered to myself, "You're not invisible anymore." The shift came slowly, but unmistakably. A cousin reached out on social media saying my parents were telling people I had gone off the rails and that I was too proud to forgive. I didn't respond, but I screenshotted everything. It was confirmation of what I already knew. They weren't sorry. They were just uncomfortable with the silence my absence left behind. I had become a mirror they couldn't control, a reflection of all the things they refused to face, that terrified them more than any diagnosis ever could. But while they spun their version of events, I kept building. I upgraded to a better job, started consulting for a wellness startup, and quietly put away savings. I published an anonymous essay online about medical gaslighting, and it went viral. People wrote to me with stories so similar, it made my hands shake. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I was part of something bigger, a community of people who had clawed their way out of the dark with nothing but their own instincts to guide them. And then it happened. My parents found the essay. I never mentioned names, but they recognized the story. My mother sent one final message. "You made us look like monsters." I read it twice and then deleted it, because I hadn't made them look like anything. I had simply told the truth, and the truth, when revealed with calm and clarity, doesn't need to yell. It just stands, tall, unapologetic, unmoved. After that last message from my mother, the silence became permanent. Not the kind you fear, the kind you earn. I had spent so much of my life trying to keep peace in a war zone, trying to prove my pain was real to people who would rather set fire to the evidence than sit with the discomfort of their failure. But now I had nothing left to prove, and while they unraveled in whispers and half-truths, I expanded, quietly, strategically, completely. I began mentoring other young adults who had experienced medical gaslighting or family betrayal. I never used my name publicly. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. I was interested in helping people survive. One girl, 17, wrote to say that reading my essay gave her the courage to get a second opinion. They found her autoimmune condition just in time. I cried when I read that. Not from pain, but from validation. All those years I spent being called too dramatic had planted seeds, and now those seeds were saving lives. My suffering had bloomed into someone else's protection. The house I grew up in, that stiff, cold place where love had to be earned through silence, became a symbol of decay. Not physically, but emotionally. My sister, the only one still living at home, texted one night in a rare moment of honesty, "Things are tense here. Mom cries a lot. Dad barely speaks." I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. I had become the absence they couldn't name. Not out of vengeance, but consequence. When you erase someone long enough, eventually they vanish. And sometimes the space they leave behind is more haunting than any argument. I kept working, kept growing. I moved into a better apartment with tall windows and quiet light. I started journaling again, not to vent, but to remember the small wins. The meals I made for myself. The mornings I woke up pain-free. I documented the ordinary beauty of freedom. No alarms in my chest. No heavy silences at the dinner table. Just air and breath and peace. I was no longer surviving. I was living fully. There was never a moment of public collapse for them. No courtroom drama, no family intervention, just slow, quiet decay. Invitations that stopped coming, calls left unanswered, relationships fraying under the weight of everything they refused to face. That was the justice. Not explosive, not loud, just undeniable. A life rebuilt from ash, standing taller than anything they could control, and all I had to do was keep going. One afternoon, I stood in the mirror and touched the scar on my neck again. It had faded to a thin silver line. Not ugly, not shameful, just real, a quiet badge of everything I'd endured and everything I'd chosen not to become. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need revenge speeches or final letters. The MRI had spoken. The silence had spoken. My life was the only answer left. The first time I truly noticed I was free, it wasn't some dramatic sunrise or celebration. It was in the middle of folding laundry. I was standing barefoot in my apartment, listening to soft music, when it hit me, the absence of tension. No one was watching me with suspicion. No one was about to dismiss my breathlessness or question my silence. The air was still, my heartbeat steady. It wasn't joy that filled me, but a deeper, quieter feeling, relief. And it made me realize how long I had lived waiting for an emotional ambush. I started building new rituals, not because I needed control, but because I had finally earned choice. I made my own doctor appointments and asked questions without fear of being labeled dramatic. I tracked my healing like a gardener watches sprouts. There were days my throat still ached and the fatigue clung to my bones, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like recovery, And even when the physical pain returned, it came without shame. My body was no longer a battleground. It was a sacred space being restored. I never posted updates. I never reached out to tell them what I'd become. Letting them see my life from a distance, if they even looked, was enough. Their access to me had expired, and the boundaries I once thought would isolate me became the gates that protected my peace. I used to believe that closure required conversation, but now I understood something deeper. Closure is not given, it's created in silence, when you decide you no longer need to be understood to be free. Sometimes people asked, "Do you still talk to them?" And I'd smile, not out of bitterness, but because I understood something they didn't. Some wounds only close when they're no longer reopened. Reconciliation isn't always possible, not when the foundation was denial. My healing didn't require them to change. It only required me to stop shrinking to fit their comfort zones. And that decision, more than any medicine or therapy, saved me. I began writing again, this time for myself. Not about the tumor, not about the betrayal, but about the future. Fiction, poetry, quiet essays about stillness and courage. I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I was building legacy. My story wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I chose to become in the aftermath. And that shift changed everything. One evening, I looked at an old photo of myself at 17. I barely recognized the boy. Eyes full of uncertainty, shoulders hunched from always preparing to defend his own pain. I wanted to reach back in time and whisper, "You were never crazy, you were never weak, you were just in the wrong room." And now, finally, I had walked out of it and closed the door behind me. About a year after my surgery, I received an email from a major non-profit. They had read my anonymous essays and wanted to bring me on as a communications lead for a campaign on medical gaslighting and youth advocacy. It didn't feel real. The organization had global reach, a name my younger self would have never believed would know mine. I read the email twice, then again, not because I doubted their interest, but because I needed to absorb what this moment really meant. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know about the burned diagnosis, the collapsed bookstore moment, or the scar on my neck. All they knew was that I wrote with a clarity and fire that Teeb trusted. That was all that mattered. I had turned my worst season into a language others could heal through, and now it was opening doors I never thought I'd walk through, not in spite of the silence I'd endured, but because I had finally decided to speak. The offer came with relocation, travel, and a salary I could live on comfortably. I didn't hesitate. I signed it. Not to run from my past, but to stretch into a future it had once tried to crush. I packed again, this time not with fear, but with intention. The apartment I was leaving had cradled my healing, but now it was time to rise higher. I wrote a short note on a post-it before I locked the door. "Thank you for holding me while I rebuilt." When I moved to the new city, everything felt unfamiliar, and I welcomed it. No memories tied to corners, no ghosts of arguments past, just potential. I walked into my new office with the quiet confidence of someone who had been through the fire and didn't need to prove it. My boss shook my hand and said, "We're lucky to have you." I nodded. No, I thought. I'm lucky I never gave up on myself. In the weeks that followed, I shared parts of my story in campaign meetings, strategy calls, and fundraising events, not for sympathy but for change. Each time I saw the ripple effect, nurses nodding, survivors weeping, parents finally listening. My voice, once silenced in a kitchen filled with judgment, was now being amplified in rooms that mattered. It wasn't vengeance, it was purpose. And through it all, I never once mentioned my family. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. This chapter wasn't about what they did to me. It was about what I chose to do with what they left behind. And that distinction made all the difference. 2 years into my new life, I received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, no return address, but the script was unmistakable. My mother. The paper smelled faintly of her perfume, a scent that used to mean warmth, but now stirred nothing in me. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won. The letter was strange. It didn't say sorry. It didn't say anything directly, just a page of musings about the past, with veiled hints that she didn't know what to do back then, and that everyone makes mistakes. There was no ownership, no acknowledgement of what she'd done when she burned my diagnosis or dismissed my collapse as an act. Just an invitation to visit sometime if I felt like reconnecting. I read it 3 times and felt nothing, not rage, not sadness, just distance. Like watching someone try to shout through a soundproof window. I folded it neatly and tucked it into a drawer, not to keep, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Her reaching out was proof that the silence had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could, and I knew, somewhere deep down, that they had started to realize what they had lost. Not just a son, but the version of me that once sought their love like oxygen. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned to breathe on his own. There were days when I wondered what would happen if I showed up at their door. Successful, calm, and whole. But then I realized that fantasy still came from the part of me that wanted justice through recognition, and that was no longer necessary. My justice had arrived in the form of peace, so full it no longer needed an audience. Sometimes peace looks like a declined invitation. Sometimes it looks like deleting a contact without explanation. And sometimes peace looks like living so fully, so freely, that no one can ever convince you to return to a place that demanded your silence in exchange for belonging. I had learned that, and I wasn't going to forget it. So, I lit a candle that night. Not for them, but for me, for the boy who was silenced, the young man who collapsed, and the survivor who rose. This was no longer a survival story. It was a resurrection. Redemption came slowly, not as a grand moment of success, but as a life filled with choices I no longer had to explain. I joined panels, spoke at universities, and continued mentoring quietly. People assumed I had a supportive background, a family who believed in me. I didn't correct them. The truth was too heavy for most to carry. And besides, I didn't need validation anymore. What I needed, and had, was freedom. I used to think I'd only feel redeemed if I confronted them, forced them to see what they did. But as the years passed, I realized that confrontation was just another way of seeking permission, and I didn't need it. I had rewritten my story in rooms they'd never enter, and that was enough. I had become the kind of man I needed when I was young, steady, kind, and unshakable. Redemption was in every choice I made for myself, in the boundaries I held firm. In the mornings I woke up and didn't feel fear in my chest. I no longer braced for the next denial, the next dismissal. I no longer rehearsed responses to accusations that never should have existed. I just lived, fully, quietly, powerfully. Occasionally, I'd pass by young people who looked like I once did, unsure, withdrawn, doubting their own signals, and I'd find a way to let them know they weren't alone. A conversation, a shared story, a quiet hand on the shoulder. That to me was the greatest revenge of all, becoming the person I had needed for someone else. Not bitter, not broken, just whole and aware. Because some victories don't look like revenge, they look like healing so completely. Your past stops echoing, and your future answers every question they refuse to. I don't know if my parents ever truly understood what they did. I don't think they will, and I've made peace with that. Some people are so afraid of being wrong, They'll let truth die before they admit fault. I used to think I needed them to see. Now I realize the only person who needed to see was me. I see myself now, fully, scarred and all, not as broken, not as fragile, but as someone who rose from neglect and denial into purpose and clarity. My voice, once stolen, is now the foundation of everything I do. I don't whisper anymore. I don't ask for permission to speak. I just speak. The scar on my neck has faded, but I still touch it sometimes, not to remember the pain, but to honor the moment I stopped letting anyone else define me. I survived the silence. I survived the gaslighting. I survived the burning of my truth. And now, I stand as living proof that you can lose everything and still become more than they ever imagined. So, if you're listening to this and you've been silenced, doubted, dismissed, let me say this clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not dramatic. You are not too much. You are real. And your body, your truth, your pain, they all deserve to be heard, even if the people closest to you refuse to listen. Walk away, walk forward, and let your healing be your loudest answer. Because in the end, the last word isn't theirs, it's yours.